All right, Dr. Wall, you are live. So I'm going to head back to another meeting, but everything is set up. Your microphone's over here. Lights over here. Good to go? If you need me, I'm going to assist you. Okay, thank you.
They're good guys. They're good guys. But they just pick the ball. Sometimes they're not bad. They pick the ball. They do have better. Well, they got better nutrition stuff. I was gonna say, I bet they're going to the south. We got severe spinners in here. 126 people so far. That's the end of it.
Yeah, mine hasn't been in 4 years, so. Mine has been in 4 years, so, yeah. Oh, you are? It's been a few years, yeah. I was born in 67, yeah. Wow. So which was harder for the Vietnam or Actually, never like.
Well, yeah, but my problem
Why bother? Why do you? Oh, that's.
not quite there yet. Almost there.
And it was long, she had water. So that's it. It was long, she had gotten. And then she went down there. But they got up the tent.
Luck is deceiving. I want the electricity.
That's right. Well, sure, right over here.
I'm gonna add the chair to your side if that's all right. That's it.
I don't see anybody else coming in from the parking lot, so I think we can get started. Can you hear me okay? How about now? Nothing? Oh, sorry, it's on. Turn it on. How about now? I just love technology. How's that? Sound all right? Well, welcome back, the few, the proud, those who are hanging in there to the very end. We return to where we left off in John's text, equipped now with the knowledge of how some outside the Catholic Church misinterpret those verses. A word of warning, some of you may find some of the visions in this lesson to be, shall we say, disturbing, perhaps even repulsive. Hang in there. For the best news, we talk about the good news. The best news is what we'll talk about next week. In the meantime, however, join with me in a word of prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of the faithful, and kindle in them the fire of love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. So we're going to start in chapter 19, where John writes this. Then I saw the heavens opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider was called Faithful and True. He judges and wages war in righteousness. His eyes were like a fiery flame, and on his head were many diadems. He had a name inscribed that no one knows except himself. He wore a cloak that had been dipped in blood, and his name was called the Word of God. The armies of heaven followed him, mounted on white horses, who were in clean white linen. Now, most scholars agree that the rider of the white horse is Christ. Some even go so far as to say that the rider of the white horse with the four horsemen of the apocalypse was Christ. No. The only thing they have in common is the color of the horse. But why do we think that Christ is the head of, is the rider of the white horse? Well, because of the words that John uses to describe them. He is called faithful and true, while Christ is described as the faithful and true witness in chapter 3. His eyes are like that of a fiery flame, which is the same description of the Son of Man in chapter 1. And his name is the Word of God. Think of the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Let's read on. Out of his mouth came a sharp sword to strike the nations. He will rule them with an iron rod, and he himself will tread out the winepress, the wine of the fury and wrath of God the Almighty. He has a name written on his cloak, and on his thigh, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The sharp sword coming out of his mouth is similar to the description of the Son of Man in chapter 1. He will rule with an iron rod, which we use to identify the child in chapter 12, the woman, the son, about to give birth to the child, who would rule the nations with an iron rod. And although he didn't say it earlier, John now identifies Christ as the one who stamps out the grapes, who treads the winepress. And the last part of this passage is yet another source for Handel's Hallelujah chorus. And remember, of course, if Christ is Lord, by implication, Caesar is not. Richard Bauckham says that John uses militaristic language in a non-militaristic sense. The 7 messages to the churches offer no hint that any of John's readers were tempted to take up arms against the Roman authority. He uses these metaphors to alert the readers to the fact of what is going on around them in their social and political life, because it is part of a conflict that has cosmic proportions. As we will see, followers of Christ do not actually fight in the final battle. God alone is the victor. Anyone who's out there promoting a militia for Christ has not understood the messages to the churches. Let's move on. Then I saw an angel standing on the sun. That's a strange statement, isn't it? Angel standing on the sun. He cried out in a loud voice to all the birds flying high overhead, "Come here, gather for God's great feast, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of military officers, the flesh of warriors, the flesh of horses and of their riders, and the flesh of all, free and slave, small and great." Oh, gross. And before you took this course and prepared for this lesson, had you ever heard that before? Did you know it was in the Bible? You certainly don't hear it in the lectionary on Sunday morning. I just love to have Father Frost put a homily together on that passage. Huh. Well, why is it so disturbing? Come on, people, help me out. It's just disgusting, isn't it? Well, John's intended audience would know what he's alluding to, and we don't. There's a passage in Ezekiel chapter 39, where Ezekiel describes the final battle against Gog. And in that battle, it's followed by a feast for the birds and beasts on the flesh of the mighty who have fallen. Notice that in Ezekiel, they just eat the mighty. Here, they eat everything. This is equal opportunity. Then I saw the beast. The beast. The beast is the beast from the sea. Okay. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered to fight against the one riding the horse and against his army. The beast was caught, and with it the false prophet who had performed in its sight the signs by which he led astray those who had accepted the mark of the beast and those who had worshipped his image. The two were thrown alive into the fiery pool burning with sulfur. Make sure we got the characters correct here. The beast is the first beast from the sea, who some people call the Antichrist. And the false prophet is the beast from the land. Mount says this, he said, a lake of burning sulfur would not only be intensely hot, but malodorous and fetid as well. It is an appropriate place for all that is sinful and wicked in the world. The rest were killed by the sword that came out of the mouth of the one riding the horse. And all the birds gorged themselves on their flesh. Boring describes this as a fearfully revolting picture. He says, those opposing Christ are also invited to a meal. But while they supposed that they were to be the guests, they turn out to be the menu. And Mounts reminds us of this. To remain unburied for the pleasure of predators was considered by the ancients to be an ignominious fate. This scene is one of universal dishonor and destruction. Note again, the rest were killed not by the army following behind him, but by the sword coming out of the mouth of the one who rides the white horse. The followers of Christ are not engaged in the final battle. If it's repeated, it's important. So is this truly the final battle? Is John describing Armageddon? Well, most scholars think so. But it's curious that he never mentions that name in his description of the battle. Stay tuned, there's more to come. Then I saw an angel come down from heaven holding in his hand the key to the abyss and a heavy chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, which is the devil or Satan, and tied it up for 1,000 years and threw it into the abyss, which he locked over it and sealed, so that it could no longer lead the nations astray until the 1,000 years are completed. After this, it is to be released for a short time. You know, I really never consciously realized how much I hate the New American Bible translation until I just taught this course. I don't know why they consistently refer to Satan as it. The Greek is clearly masculine, but it makes it awfully hard to read. It will be released. It makes him sound impersonal. That Satan is some kind of a force rather than a personage. The word abyss, we read this passage 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, wasn't it? 3 weeks ago when we talked about the millennium. Okay? If it sounds familiar, it's the right. The abyss comes from a Greek word which means bottomless or unfathomed. And note that in verse 2, all 4 of the titles given to the enemy of God are included there. Satan is tied up for 1,000 years. And he says, so that he could no longer lead the nations astray. Now, how you interpret that statement depends upon where you are coming from in relationship to the millennium. For amillennialists, remember, amillennialists believe that there is a period of time where Satan is impaired and where Christ rules, and it is the time between Christ's first advent and his second advent. Okay? So for amillennialists, during the time of the church, Satan's power is limited. That is, he is curtailed, but he is not powerless. Williamson says he is still able to tempt God's people and to oppose God's plan. On the other hand, if you are a premillennialist, believing that there's going to be a rapture of believers followed by a 7-year tribulation, followed by the return of Christ for the third time, followed by a 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ. Premillennialists, on the other hand, believe that during that time period, during the reign of Christ and the saints, Satan will be rendered completely inactive. For them, the elaborate measures taken to ensure his custody imply the complete cessation of his influence on earth, rather than a curbing of his activities. But note what John says and what he doesn't say. All the text actually says is that during the period designated as 1,000 years, Satan is bound and cast into the abyss, which is then locked and sealed. That's really all he says. Everything else is just conjecture. Kester reminds us that John is using word pictures to describe things that do not neatly fit within the confines of space and time. He says this: just as the door to the great abyss cannot be located on a map, the duration of the 1,000 years cannot be located on a calendar. And note the subtle foreshadowing at the end. After this, he is to be released for a short while. That kind of reminds me of Yoda. Remember in The Empire Strikes Back when he says, "There is another," as the scene fades to black. Any questions so far? Nothing. I kept you awake. So far, so good. All right. Then I saw thrones. Those who sat on them were entrusted with judgment. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or its image, nor had accepted its mark on their foreheads or hands. They came to life and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were over. This is the first resurrection. The second death has no power over these. They will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for the 1,000 years. Please tell me you find that confusing. Good, I'm not alone. I can't tell you how many hours I have poured over this paragraph, trying to make some sense of it, drawing Venn diagrams, arrows, and flow charts. What can I say? John mentions 3 actions: judging, reigning, and priestly service. Then he mentions those seated on thrones, those who have been beheaded, and those who had not worshipped the beast or accepted his mark on their foreheads. Are these separate groups, or is he describing the same one differently? If they're separate groups, how many groups are we talking about, and who's doing which action? He also refers to them as souls. Is that important? Remember, the way that we think of body and soul, and you die and your body remains behind and your soul goes off to heaven, that's really not, sorry to break this to you, that is not Jewish way of thinking. That is Greek way of thinking. But remember, with the opening of the fifth seal, John had a vision of souls under the altar. What does it mean that they came to life? Is this a special resurrection, separate and distinct from the final resurrection? Verse 5 seems to imply that. But who exactly comes to life? Just those who were beheaded? Or all martyrs? Or maybe even all believers? I will tell you that scholars are deeply divided on these issues. You can read two very learned people interpreting it completely opposite. To make matters worse, John refers to the first resurrection, but he never mentions the second one. Unless he implies the second one with the dead standing before the throne, which we'll get to in verse 12. He also refers to the second death, which he equates later on to the pool of fire. But he never defines the first one. Were you aware that Revelation used that kind of terminology? It is found nowhere else in the New Testament. So if you're scratching your head, that's a good sign.
Say, David.
Yes.
My Bible has another sentence in it. In your what you got, like this is the first resurrection and then the second death. In my Bible, after it says this is the first resurrection, then there's a sentence that says, "Blessed and holy is he who shares in the first resurrection!" Exclamation point. Then it says, "Over such the second death has no power."
Yeah, I kind of left that out because I didn't want to address it. It just makes matters even more complicated. That is one of 7 beatitudes in Revelation, and it just makes it that much more confusing. And it made me have to use a smaller font. Very confusing indeed. So with some degree of fear and trembling, let's take a crack at trying to decipher John's message. To begin with, where does this take place? Some scholars believe heaven, some believe earth. John doesn't really say exactly where the 1,000-year reign of Christ and the saints take place. Are there one or two groups of believers, that is, those who had been beheaded and those who had not worshipped the beast, even though the former is a subset of the latter? Most scholars think it's better to understand both references applying to the same group. So what about the first resurrection? Well, scholars tend to fall into one of two groups. The first group believes that the first resurrection is for martyrs, and the second resurrection is for everybody else. Another group of scholars say that the first resurrection is for all believers, and the second resurrection is for the unjust. Both of those are legitimate ways of interpreting the Greek. The problem is both of them cause problems. Let me give you an example. For those in the first group, the first resurrection is seen as a special reward for those who were faithful unto death. But Eugene Boring says that in Revelation 20, there's only one judgment scene and everyone's there. Is John implying that martyrs who reign with Christ for 1,000 years, then at the end of that 1,000 years have to stand in judgment before him? Is that what he's saying? For those in the second group, the first resurrection is a reward reserved for the faithful, while the second is one that is necessary to bring the dead to judgment. But note the implication. Believers would not face judgment, which seems to contradict verse 13, where it says, the dead were judged according to their deeds. Now, as I said in the last lesson, dispensationalists divide the general resurrection of the dead into the resurrection of the just and the resurrection of the unjust, separated by 1,000 years. The church, on the other hand, teaches that there's only going to be one bodily resurrection of the dead, for both good and evil, and it will take place at Christ's second coming. St. Augustine taught that the first resurrection was the spiritual birth of believers, their conversion and their death to sin, that is, their baptism. That really doesn't help us clarify John's strange words and concepts contained in this paragraph. Williamson offers a different idea. He says this. Let me quote him here. The simplest solution is that the first resurrection refers to the life with Christ in heaven that the blessed, including martyrs, experience immediately after death. What Osborne calls the intermediate state. Did you hear what I said there? The first resurrection has to do with the life of what we would term the saints in heaven prior to the general resurrection at Christ's return. This is what the Catechism says. At the present time, some of his disciples are pilgrims on earth. Others have died and are being purified, purgatory, while still others are in glory, that is, saints, contemplating in full light God himself, triune and one, exactly as he is. Okay? Those are the ones who have experienced the first resurrection. Does it make any sense there? Okay. Spoiler alert. In our in our last lesson, we're going to learn that heaven is not our final destination. Stay tuned. There, I gave it away. So how about the second death? Craig Kerster believes that the phrase, the second death, refers to the eternal punishment of the unjust. Bruce Metzger describes it as final and complete separation from God, the source of life. But I like what another scholar says. He says, as there is a second and higher life, so there is also a second and deeper death. And as after that life there is no more death, so after that death there is no more life. I wish I could put words together like that. There is, however, another take on John's words, mostly promoted by Wilfred Harrington, although a few others agree with him. He cites passages in Matthew and Luke's Gospel in which a particular phrase is translated, they shall die the second death and shall not live in the world to come. Harrington believes this to mean that those souls are excluded from the resurrection. They will remain in the grave. A little more about that later on. Stay tuned. Harrington believes that John is preparing his flock for the Great Tribulation, where some may face death for their endurance in witnessing for Christ. He seeks to assure them that though their martyr death might seem to be a victory for the dragon, it will in fact mean their transfer to heaven, holy and forever beyond his reach. While they reign, he is bound. Victory is theirs, not his. Now, over the centuries, some have equated John's millennial kingdom with the Messianic age foretold by Isaiah in chapter 11 and illustrated in the artwork of Edward Hicks. But Craig Kinster says nothing is said about the earth yielding superabundant harvests, animals peacefully coexisting with each other and human beings, increased longevity, or the restoration of Jerusalem, all of which are predicted in Isaiah's prophecy. Most modern scholars believe Isaiah's prophecy of the Messianic kingdom fits better with John's description of the new creation in chapter 20, rather than the millennial reign of Christ described in chapter 20. 21 is where the new creation is, 20 is the millennial kingdom. So, to reiterate what you said before class, Tony, what exactly is John's purpose in writing about the millennial reign of Christ? He seems to be going in this straightforward direction and then just kind of veered off into this quagmire of the millennium, the reign of Christ, and the binding of Satan, the first resurrection and the second death. What in the world is going on? Did you just have a bad day? Did you not edit this part out so that it'd be a lot easier to study? There were indeed in ancient Judaism competing traditions. One said that only the just would be raised. The other said that all the dead, good and bad alike, would be raised. So John may be trying to incorporate both ideas into his narrative by inserting this 1,000-year reign of Christ and binding of Satan. Calvert points out the difference between prophecy and apocalyptic thought. In prophetic eschatology, if y'all remember, probably don't, that's okay. The difference between John speaking as a prophet and John speaking from an apocalyptic standpoint is that prophets hold out a little hope. Prophets say, y'all are really screwing up now, but if you just get your act together, none of this is going to happen. Whereas apocalyptic says there is no hope. The only thing that's going to save us is God's intervention and a whole new world. Okay? So for prophetic eschatology, the golden future is viewed as taking place on earth, within time and space as we know it, and involve those who are alive when the golden age begins. On the other hand, apocalyptic eschatology says that the golden future is going to take place in a new creation, which is beyond time and space, and involves those who have been raised from the dead. You see the difference? It's a subtle difference. Any questions? I ran across that one. Okay. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. Did you notice something in that line? I didn't notice it until I actually put it up on the screen. All of a sudden, now we're in masculine pronouns. The Greek didn't change at all. Just the committee decided to change their mind. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. He will go out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. Strange parallel. They invaded the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the holy ones and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. That's it. That's the description of the final battle. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. There it is. Kind of anticlimactic, isn't it? Done. I think it's the equivalent of God said, let there be light. There was light. There's no intermediate, no waiting for it. It just happened. The devil who had led them astray was thrown into the pool of fire and sulfur, where the beast and false prophet were. There they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Osborne notes this. For 1,000 years, those among the nations who worship the beast will be under Jesus' sovereign control and ruled by the saints. They will not experience Satan or be deceived by him in any way. And yet, after 14 lifetimes of enforced good, as soon as Satan is released, they allow themselves to be deceived all over again. Question: is this the same battle that John described in chapter 19, or is it a different one? Well, most scholars believe it's the same battle. For the Greek uses the definitive article. Satan gathers them for the battle, referring to the last battle foretold by the prophets, the Battle of Armageddon. Williamson says viewing them as two separate battles just seems to introduce too many unnecessary perplexities. But Harrington reminds us that the decisive battle will not be fought at Armageddon. The decisive battle was won on the cross. Got that? It's an accomplished fact. How about Gog and Magog? John is referencing Ezekiel Chapter 38, but in Ezekiel, Gog is the king of the region of Magog. And at Revelation, both Gog and Magog are anthropomorphized, and Magog is just another character fighting alongside Gog. Note in verse 8 that their number is like the sand of the sea. Remember, this is the penultimate battle, the final act of God dealing once and for all with evil. And Boring says, for John's picture of the ultimate destruction of evil, he names antagonists to God who are larger than life. But once again, there's really no battle at all. Without any struggle, fire comes from heaven and destroys the enemies of God's people. Sad. Done with. The first rebellion of Satan was quelled by Michael the archangel, and Satan was defeated, cast out of heaven, and thrown to the earth. The second rebellion was crushed by another angel, and this time Satan was banished from the earth and locked up in the abyss, if only for a short time. Satan's third and final rebellion is suppressed by heavenly means also. That is, fire came down from heaven. But this time, the defeat of Satan is definitive. He is thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, where he will be tormented forever. Some people are really uncomfortable with the idea of being judged by God. They find it hard to reconcile with God being all loving and all forgiving. But Craig Kester reminds us that warnings of judgment are designed to unsettle the readers, while promises of salvation and blessing are designed to encourage them. Together they serve the same purpose, which is perseverance in faith. Next I saw a large white throne and the one who was sitting on it. The earth and the sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. I saw the dead, the great and the lowly, standing before the throne. Scrolls were opened. And another scroll was opened, the book of life. The dead were judged according to their deeds, by what was written in the scroll. The sea gave up its dead. Then death and Hades gave up their dead. All the dead were judged according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the pool of fire. This pool of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the pool of fire. There are two different, though not necessarily contradictory, interpretations of John's words, saying, "The earth and the sky fled from his presence." John may simply be referring to creation's awe before its creator and judge. Bruce Metzger says, "The one seated on the throne is so radiant and consuming that earth and sky vanish like dew in the sun." However, his inclusion of the phrase, "there was no place for them," may also refer to the dissolution of the universe in preparation for the new heaven and the new earth, which will shortly appear next week. In 2 Peter, we read, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a mighty roar, and the elements will be dissolved by fire, and the earth and everything done on it will be found out." So what is the point of the two books? This is the book of life over here. And these are the books of deeds over here. The image of the book of life comes from an ancient custom of having a formal registry of the citizens of a city. So those whose names are written in the book of life will be the citizens of the New Jerusalem. The image of the book of deeds implies that human actions matter to God. For it says we are ultimately responsible for what we do, for it has eternal consequences. But God is ultimately responsible for our salvation. It is his deed that saves, not ours. So within these few verses, we have the paradox of God's plan of salvation. We are judged according to our deeds. St. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, "We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive recompense according to what he did to the body, whether good or evil." And yet we are saved by God's grace. The same St. Paul writes to the Ephesians, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from you, it is the gift of God. It is not from works, so no one may boast." When I look back on my journey to Catholicism, I see evidence of it over about a 10-year period. I know that because I was teaching that whole time, so I can go back and look at my notes. And yes, my wife will tell you that I keep notes forever. I have notes for college. I don't know. A hoarder of notes. But when I look at that 10 plus years of spiritual journey, I detect a subtle but profound change in the way I looked at that. It was moving from an either-or mentality to a both-and mentality. An example of either-or mentality was a course that I studied multiple times, which was entitled Grace or Works, Which Way to Righteousness? You hear that either or in there? It's either my way or the highway. On the other hand, when I look at the catechism, which I read cover to cover during RCIA, the catechism is just full of both-and statements. Probably the most prominent one is that we profess a belief that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. That just doesn't make any sense. It only has meaning through the eyes of faith. But you're not going to achieve that insight through intellect, no matter how hard you try. What we have here is what appears to be on the surface a contradiction. That is, we are judged by our works, and we are saved by grace. How does that fit together? Obviously, that means that judging and saving are the same thing. And if we are judged according to our works, what are the ramifications of that? What does that mean? Personally, I am very frustrated that we live in an either-or society. And that's new. I practiced medicine for 30 years before a patient asked me how I voted in an election.
I was curious.
You have to know who said that, but we're not. We have moved into this either-or mentality where those who disagree with me are my enemies. And that's just simply not the truth. Many of those who disagree with me, who look at the same thing and see something different, are my brothers and sisters in Christ, and we need to go back to that. We need to have more dialogue and discussion and less debate. Sorry, I digress. Collins says that the image of election and non-election is placed side by side with the image of human responsibility, and no contradiction is perceived between them. Harrington writes this: John, like the Bible in general, does not attempt to resolve the tension. Later Christian theologians courageously, stubbornly, and vainly strove to find a way past the dilemma. But the theologians of the Bible, in their wisdom, were content to leave the matter in the hands of God. There is, folks, a dynamic tension in the gospel. I don't mean the first 4 books of the New Testament. I mean the message of the gospel, the good news that we're supposed to be sharing. There is a dynamic tension, a both and. A few weeks ago, one of the readings was from John's gospel about the woman caught in adultery. Do you remember what Jesus said to her? He said 2 things. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. You have to embrace both of those equally to understand this whole idea of being judged by your deeds and saved by grace. Rather than fighting or trying to resolve that tension, we need to embrace it. It is the power of the gospel. The mention of the sea. It was widely believed that those lost at sea had no access to Sheol, Hebrew, or Hades, Greek. So in specifically naming the sea, John emphasizes that he is describing a general resurrection. Here, anthropomorphized as they were in the 4th horse in chapter 6, death and Hades now join the unholy trinity in the pool of fire. So did you get that? First the beast and the false prophet, the first and the second beast, are thrown into the pool of fire. Then Satan himself is thrown into the pool of fire, and now death and Hades are thrown into the pool of fire. But of greater concern is what is written in verse 15. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the pool of fire. The imagery of perpetual fire originates in the last chapter of Isaiah, which speaks of God gathering his people from all the nations to establish his kingdom, and of an inextinguishable fire as the final punishment of the wicked. But it is the eternal part of their punishment which so troubles those who are promoting the idea of universal salvation. There simply isn't time to go into it in detail, and it's almost as confusing as that paragraph that we stumbled through earlier. I've included a summary in your handout, and we're going to go over just the basics here. In 1 Timothy, God says, this is good and pleasing to God our Savior, who wills everyone to be saved and to come to knowledge of the truth. The idea that God not only desires the salvation of everyone, but will someday achieve this goal is not a new one. Several of the early church fathers, mostly those in the East, wrote about it and promoted it extensively. It has recently become a hot topic again, especially among academic circles. The most notable proponent is a guy named David Bentley Hart, who is an Eastern Orthodox theologian who has taught at St. Louis University and Notre Dame. Now, I will be the first to admit my bias. For me, a major roadblock to embracing his arguments is his condescending attitude toward those who disagree with him. One critic found 118 derogatory comments in his book. It's only 120 pages long. As for himself, this is what he says: I cannot alter my views since they are almost certainly correct. You get the feeling what we're dealing with here? You also need a thesaurus when you read his book, because he is quite proud of his vocabulary and shows it off. Nevertheless, after reading his book twice, I did at least pause long enough to think about what he was saying. Here's a very brief summary of his arguments. Point number one: finite creatures with limited knowledge and abilities simply cannot possibly make free, informed decisions that might condemn them to eternal punishment. He writes, and I quote, "It is sheer nonsense to suggest that we possess limitless or unqualified liberty. Therefore, we are incapable of contracting a limitless or unqualified guilt." Point number 2, a final state of eternal torment could be neither a just sentence pronounced upon nor a just faith suffered by a finite being, no matter how depraved that being might have become. What he proposes is some modified purgatory-like existence for unrepentant souls where they will endure some form of purification, but only for a limited time, after which they will join the elect as citizens of the New Jerusalem. Here's his bottom line, and again a quote. "No one, logically speaking, could merit eternal punishment. But I also accept the obverse claim that no one could merit grace. This does not mean, however, that grace must be rare in order for it to be truly gracious. Grace universally given is still grace. A gift made to everyone is no less a gift. And a gift that is intrinsically precious need not be rare to be an act of the highest generosity." Think about Jesus' parable of the workers in the vineyard. You remember that one? Where some of the workers began working at the beginning of the day, and some were hired on at noon, and some were hired on in the middle of the afternoon. Some started working just a few minutes before quit time, and they all received the same wage. What does Jesus say there? I think he's saying that there's no gradation to God's love. That if salvation is truly an act of grace, it's an act of grace for everyone. We all end up in the same boat, no matter how much sin needs to be forgiven. Of course, I picked up his book, wanted to know how he would approach certain passages in Revelation. Boy, was I what I found was an attitude which said, in essence, I don't understand it, so it must not be important.
Blow over that part about if it's not written in the book of life.
Oh, yeah, he just totally ignores it. When in doubt, ignore what you can't explain. Let me share an example with you. He writes this. Revelation is so arcane a text that any absolute pronouncements on its nature or meaning are almost certainly misguided. I regard it as a supremely foolish enterprise for anyone to attempt to extract so much as a single clear and inarguable doctrine regarding anything at all from the text. And yet, the church fathers included it in the canon. Maybe they have some insight that this fellow lacks. He's actually very close to Martin Luther, who wanted to expunge Revelation from the Bible and didn't want to include it in his first translation of the Bible into German. He later included it but initially he thought that it did not contain Christ. I hope after this past 3 months you can see how foolish that kind of thing was. But eventually Martin Luther allowed revelation into his Bible because he used it as a tool to accuse the Pope of being Antichrist. My question to adherents of universal salvation is this. If in the end, it really doesn't matter what you say or do, what beliefs you profess, or how you live your life, that is, if we all eventually end up in the same place anyway, how does holding this belief affect your personal moral code, your service to others, or your motivation to evangelize non-believers? I think John of Patmos would say, why bother persevering in your witness for Christ? So it appears that we are left with two troublesome alternatives for those whose names are not found in the book of life. Either eternal torment in the pool of fire or prolonged purification ultimately leading to salvation. I'm not sure I like either one of those choices. But that appears to be what we're left with. However, there is a third alternative. Some scholars, most notably Wilfred Harrington and Caird, insist that being cast into the pool of fire actually implies annihilation. They quote Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, who said this: "The fire of which John speaks is everlasting and has an everlasting potential for torment, but it will totally destroy the wicked instead of torturing them forever." I think there's some validity to that, because if you notice the text very carefully, you will find these words: "There they will be tormented day and night forever and ever." That phrase is applied to the unholy Trinity, to Satan and the two beasts. It is not repeated for the unbelievers who are cast into the pool of fire. It may be that casting them as created beings, as non-angelic, as not cosmologic, is a destructive event. Well, any questions?
That's a little question.
Well, I'd like to close this lesson with a few thoughts about judgment. These come from Olson's book. Olson's the one that wrote "Will Catholics Be Left Behind?" And this is what he says. We tend to think of judgment as a future event on the other side of the grave. But judgment is more than just a future reality. It takes place each time man commits evil and rejects God. Judgment is an eschatological event, and it occurs every moment of every day. Far from being the action of an angry and vengeful God, judgment is an act of love, an act of transcendent and objective justice, whose existence is meant to cause mankind to convert. This final judgment is not primarily concerned with revenge, but with holiness and truth, where they are at the heart of each man's relationship with the righteous one. Catholic teaching emphasizes individual eschatology, because our lives are the one part of reality and history that we control and for which we are held accountable. Next week, we're finally going to arrive at the good news, the best news. Your Your reading assignment is actually chapters 21 and 22. That's what we're going to go over. But I'd like you to also go back and reread Christ's messages to the churches and see if you can find fulfillment of those messages in the new creation. I want you to connect the dots. I'd like you to come back with 3 or 4 insights from John's book. What did he say to you, to us, to all generations? Any questions? See you next week.